Okay, here we are. Thank you all for being here. Already see a lot of people. That's good. That's very good. And thank you, Elisabeth, for being here with us today with this class mode today we have. And today, again, is Elisabeth Lemaire from Institut de Physique de Nice, so in France, who's going to give us a class about the rheology of concentrated non-Brownian suspensions. So, well, I don't know if you know, I did my PhD in her group when I was in Nice, so it's an honor for me having her here today, being a host and hosting her for a class. So I give you the word, Elisabeth. You can start sharing your slides, and that should interrupt my presentation. Perfect.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
On the left, au tout début à gauche. Voilà.
Okay. Is it okay? Can you see my first slide?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So thank you.
Just before starting, people, if you have questions, raise your hand. You have the button at the bottom, and or write your question in the chat, and we're gonna interrupt Elisabeth and ask the questions on the go. Is it okay for you, Elisabeth, or you prefer to just?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, perfect.
So first of all, I would like to thank Michel and Leah for their this beautiful initiative, which brings together all the young rheologists over the world. So that's a good, very good idea, and I'm particularly happy to be here with you today. I'm not a teacher, so I don't know if I'm able to give a class, but I'm going to try. And I'm going to talk about rheology of non-Brownian suspensions, and I'm going to show you various features of these objects. And in particular, I'm going to show you that they are strange objects, very different from, for instance, polymers that are that have been studied a lot. And you are going to see that non-Brownian suspensions behave very, very differently. So our institute is the Institut de Physique de Nice. Before, it was in a beautiful park here. You can see on this picture. You can see my mouse? Yes? Yes, okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay. But now we moved to this awful zone near the airport. Anyway, we have the rheology to make us happy, and the rheology of non-Brownian suspension. So we are going to focus on these beautiful objects. Non-Brownian suspensions are involved in many, many applications, industrial applications, as for instance, the propellant of the Ariane rockets. So the booster of the Ariane rockets are made of a past that consists in energetic particles dispersed in a polymer. And so it's the propulsion of the rocket depends on the spatial repartition of the energetic particles. So it's really important to control the flow of this past when the past is introduced into the huge mold that will be the boosters of the rockets. Of course, fresh concrete is also an emblematic example of non-Brownian concentrated suspension. You can also find non-Brownian suspensions in almost all composite materials that make our daily life objects. And you can also find non-Brownian suspensions in various natural flows, such as blood, that is a suspension of red blood cells, and also in muds or in volcanic lava. So it's important to understand and to characterize the rheological behavior of these non-Brownian suspension. Well, of course, in all these applications, the suspensions themselves can be very complex. The particles can have different sizes and shapes. The suspending liquid can be non-Newtonian. The particles may be deformable. You can have buoyancy effect if the density of the particles and of the suspending liquid is not the same. But today we are going to focus on much more simple suspensions made of spherical particles and dispersed in a Newtonian fluid. And the density of the particles and of the suspending liquid will be the same. We are also going to consider very, very simple flows, mainly viscosimetric flows. So that means that the flow will be a simple shear flow, most of the time with a constant shear rate. And to give you some order of magnitudes, the particles have a size of a few tenths of microns. The shear rate will be of the order of 1 second minus 1, and the viscosity of the suspending liquid is of about a few hundreds Pascal second. So with this order of magnitude, we can observe that the Peclet number is the ratio of the diffusion time to the convective time. So the diffusion time is given by the KBT, with KB the Boltzmann constant, T the temperature. So KBT divided by C 6p eta dot and the radius of the particles to the power 3. And the convective time is just the inverse of the shear rate. So this Peclet number will be very, very large. And so that means that we can neglect Brownian motion. With this order of magnitudes, we can also see that inertia does not play any role, since the Reynolds number that you can compute at the particle scale, it is the case here, but you could also compute the Reynolds number at the flow scale. And in both cases, the Reynolds number is very small. Sorry, is very small. So inertia can be neglected. So we have a very simple suspension and a very simple flow, but we can observe quite complex behaviors with these systems. So let us see first the variation of the shear viscosity, more precisely the viscosity divided by the viscosity of the suspending liquid. And let us see how this relative viscosity varies with the particle volume fraction. So you know that if the concentration of the particle is very low, typically the particle volume fraction lower than 2%, then particles do not see, one particle does not see the other particles. And so to compute the viscosity, we just have to take into account the perturbation of the flow in the suspending liquid, And it's what has been done by Einstein to find this very famous law for the variation of the viscosity with the particle volume fraction. When you increase the particle concentration, then you have to take into account pair interactions between particle pair interaction. So you have to introduce a term in phi square, and again, you can have a theoretical expression for the variation of the viscosity with the particle volume fraction, but this time it's a little bit more complicated because the factor here, 6.2, depends on the type of flow you consider. And here the value 6.2 is the value for a simple shear flow. But for instance, if you consider an elongational flow, or if you consider a Brownian suspension, then this numerical factor has to be changed. And so this this expression given by Bachelor is valid for particle concentration, typically lower than 0.1. And if you increase again the particle volume fraction, then you do not have any theoretical expression for the variation of the relative viscosity with the particle volume fraction. And you have to refer to phenomenological or semi-phenomenological laws deduced from experiments and also from semi-quantitative arguments. For instance, it's the case of the laws proposed by Akrivos, not by Quemada and Mills. The laws are based on semi-quantitative arguments. And you can also refer to experimental results. And for instance, Andrea Akrivos has made a lot for the understanding of suspension rheology. So you can also refer to numerical simulations, and in particular the first accurate numerical simulations have been made by John Brady and George Bossis with the Stokesian dynamics method. And from all these results, experimental or numerical results, you can obtain that the viscosity, the variation of the viscosity with the particle volume fraction can be described by this phenomenological law. So the viscosity increases when the particle volume fraction increases, and diverges when the particle volume fraction tends to a critical value, that is the jamming fraction. And the exponent here is close to 2. Okay, so if you look at all the numerical and experimental results in the literature, and it has been all these results have been collected by Elisabeth Guazelli and Olivier Pouliquin. And here you can see that it's right, the relative viscosity is a function of phi over phi m. But if you look in more detail, and you can observe that the value of the jamming fraction, phi m, varies in a wide interval. And the reason for this variation of phi m is not completely clear. I would like to show you another very beautiful behavior of a non-Brownian suspension, that is the hydrodynamic irreversibility. So before to do that, I would like to show you, maybe you have already seen this experiment, but it is so beautiful that I would like to show you it again. So it's the Taylor reversibility experiment. So you take a quet cell and you fill this quet cell with viscous liquid. Here, for instance, it's glycerol. And you rotate, before you introduce a droplet of the same fluid, but with a dye. And after that, you rotate the inner cylinder. So you can make several revolutions. Here, I think there will be 4 revolutions. No, 5. Okay, so the droplet has been extended, so it's not apparent yet. But when you rotate the inner cylinder in the opposite direction, then you can observe that the droplet is again in its initial shape. So that this beautiful experiment, it's a very, very old experiment, but this beautiful experiment shows that at low Reynolds number, flow is reversible. But if you do the same kind of experiment with suspension, you are going to obtain something very, very different. And it is this experiment proposed by Pine. And you put concentrated suspension in quet cell geometry, and you are going to oscillate the inner cylinder. And you take images of the suspension with a frequency that is the same as the oscillating frequency of the inner cylinder. And then if you do this experiment with a low oscillating amplitude, then you observe almost nothing. You can see that only the cycles, the timer changes, but after each oscillation, all the particles come back to their initial position. But if you do the same experiment with an amplitude that is a little bit higher, then you observe that the particles do not return to their initial position, but have a kind of random walk motion. And the motion of the particles can be represented by a diffusion coefficient that is a function of the oscillation amplitude, as we have seen before. Here, if the amplitude is low, there is no diffusion, or if the amplitude is larger, there is a diffusion. And this diffusion coefficient depends also on the particle size and on the shear rate. So that means that if you shear concentrated suspension with a shear rate that is not constant, that is not spatially constant, then the diffusion coefficient varies, spatially varied, and this spatial variation of the diffusion coefficient leads to shear-induced particle migration, and the particles migrate toward the regions where the shear rate is the lowest. So here, for instance, in a wide gap quet geometry, the shear rate is higher near the inner cylinder than near the outer cylinder. Then particles tend to migrate outward, and it's what you can see here on this experimental curve obtained by Phillips a long time ago. And it's also what you can observe in a Poiseuille flow. So here I have put some results from the PhD of Michel. See? So in a Poiseuille flow, the shear rate is lower at the center than near the walls, and the particles tend to migrate toward the center of the channel. Okay, with non-Brownian suspensions, we have also many non-Newtonian effects. In particular, we have anisotropic normal stresses. So the normal stresses are yes, just some words about normal stresses. We talk about normal stress differences because it's not the value of the normal stress in a direction that is important, because what is important is the difference, because you have to subtract the isotropic pressure. That is not, the pressure is not a characteristic of the material. The pressure is a characteristic of the flow, but it is not a material function that characterizes the material. So to characterize the material, you have to measure the anisotropy of the normal stresses. So we used to define two normal stress differences. The first one is the normal stress is the stress, normal stress in the velocity direction minus the normal stress in the velocity gradient direction. And the second normal stress difference is the difference between the normal stress in the velocity gradient direction and the normal stress in the vorticity direction. So complex material, it's quite usual to observe normal stress differences in complex materials, but for non-Brownian suspensions, the normal stress differences are very different from what we know for polymers. And here I have listed some differences between polymers and suspensions. So in polymers, the normal stress differences are proportional to the shear rate to the square, while for the suspensions, the normal stress differences are proportional to the shear stress. In polymers, the first normal stress is much higher than the second one, and the first normal stress is positive, while for the suspension, the first normal stress is much smaller than the second normal stress difference, and the second normal stress difference is negative. So you observe that it's very different, and these differences in the normal stress differences give rise to behaviors that are very different for polymers or for suspensions. And for instance, if you make the very simple rotating rod experiment, so it just consists in rotate a rod in the material. If you do that with a polymer, you are going to observe that the polymer climbs along the rod. But for non-Brownian suspensions, you observe that the suspension dips near the rod. Okay. Among the non-Newtonian behaviors, we also have discontinuous shear thickening. This behavior is quite popular. I'm quite sure that you know the behavior of corn starch suspensions. So the discontinuous shear thickening means that the viscosity is low at low shear rate or at low shear stress. And when you increase the shear rate or the shear stress, then you observe an abrupt increase of the viscosity. And this transition from the low viscosity to the high viscosity has been explained quite recently by the group of Geoffrey Morris, by a transition from a frictionless flow, so a flow where the particles do not experience contact, because the particles are experience repulsive forces that prevent the particles to come into contact. But if you increase the shear rate or the shear stress, then you push the particles and they can come into contact. And when they are in contact, they can interact through frictional forces, and the frictional forces between the particles increases the viscosity of the suspension. We also observe shear thinning behavior in non-Brownian suspensions. The shear thinning behavior is quite well known for Brownian suspensions, and it is well known that the viscosity is a function of reduced shear stress, and this reduced shear stress is the ratio of the applied stress, sigma, over a thermal stress, kT over A to the power 3. And this reduced shear stress is almost the Peclet number. And so you observe a shear thinning behavior when the Peclet number, you remember the Peclet number is the ratio of the diffusion time to the convective time. And you observe the shear thinning when these two times, the diffusion time and the convective times, become of the same order of magnitude. And you can have a picture to explain that the viscosity decreases when you increases the shear rate or the shear stress, because if you consider Brownian particles, then the particles are moving, and each particle occupies an effective volume that is larger than its real volume. But when you increase the flow, the shear rate or the shear stress, the convective motion becomes dominant, and you decrease the effective volume of each particles. So you decrease the effective particle volume fraction, and so you decrease the viscosity. The same kind of reasoning can be made to explain why we observe also shear thinning behavior in colloidal suspensions, because if you have a colloidal suspension with repulsive interactions between particles, then when you increase the shear stress, you promote an overlap of the repulsive distance between the particles. So the effective volume occupied by each particle decreases. So the particle volume fraction decreases, and the viscosity decreases also. And if you have a colloidal attractive suspension, then you can have another picture of this attractive colloidal suspension. If you have attractive forces between particles, the particles flocculate and the liquid, that is the suspending liquid that is trapped between the particles, here in blue on my screen, then this trapped liquid contributes to the solid phase and not to the liquid phase from the flow point of view. And when you increase the shear stress, you break the aggregates, and some trapped liquid is released outside the aggregates. So you decreases the effective particle volume fraction and the effective solid fraction, and then you decreases the viscosity of the suspension. But for non-Brownian suspension, until the years 2010, it was not really understood why we have shear thinning. But the shear thinning, I would like you to really know that this shear thinning is present either beyond the shear thickening transition, as shown here, for instance, by Châté, or in most non-Brownian and non-colloidal suspensions. So now I've finished my introduction, and I'm going to review some features of non-Brownian suspension. So the first thing I would like to talk about is the shear-induced microstructure, and I would like to comment on the consequences of the athermal characteristic of non-Brownian suspension. Because if the particles are athermal, that means that the suspensions, the non-Brownian suspensions, are always out of equilibrium, and their structure is controlled by the flow. So for non-Brownian suspension, we have a strong coupling between the flow, the microstructure, and the rheology. After that, I will discuss about the role of contact forces in suspension rheology. I'm going to show you that shear reversal experiments are very beautiful experiments that enable to estimate the role of the contact forces in suspension rheology. And after that, I will discuss about oscillatory measurements, and I'm going to show you that you must be very, very cautious if you want to perform oscillatory measurement with a non-Brownian suspension. And if I have time, I'm going to discuss the non-Newtonian behaviors of the suspension, but I'm not sure that I will come to this point. Okay, so the first point is that the flow controls the microstructure in a suspension. So it's important to know this microstructure, and to know this microstructure, it's important to perform local rheometry experiments. Not always, because it's not so easy to do local rheometry, but it's important to refer to local rheometry measurements in order to know if the rheometric measurement we make are valid or not. And the first point that can invalidate macroscopic rheological measurement is the wall structuring that is observed in non-Brownian suspension. So when you put a suspension between two walls, the particles tend to form layers near the walls, and in this layered zone, the viscosity of the suspension is much lower than the bulk viscosity. So that means that if the viscosity is much smaller here near the wall, the shear rate is much higher than the expected shear rate, then you have a kind of apparent wall slip. And so here you can see results obtained in our group by Enzo D'Ambrosio. And here you can see the variation of the particle volume fraction in a wide gap quad cell. And you observe that near the rotor and near the stator, you have a huge layering of the particles. And if we measure the velocity field, then we observe that a very important wall slip. Here, the velocity should be 1, and the velocity is only 0.6. And it's almost the same near the stator. So it's important to have in mind, if you make a rheometric experiment with non-Brownian suspension, that the particles are going to form layers, organize the layers near the wall. So you have some solutions if you cannot perform local rheometry. You can apply a wall slip correction as proposed by Jana, who gave an expression for the slip velocity. And you can see that the slip velocity depends on the viscosity of the suspension. So that means that the slip velocity is higher if the viscosity, the relative viscosity of the suspension is larger. And so this wall slip correction is really to take into This correction has to be done if the particle volume fraction is large. And you can also, another solution is to use a large gap. And then if you use a large gap, the impact of this particle layering will be relatively less important. And if you take a gap that is large enough, then you could neglect the particle layering and the associated apparent wall slip. You have other problems with non-Brownian suspension, and one problem, as I said before, is the shear-induced particle migration. So you remember that in a cylindrical quad geometry, particles tend to migrate toward the outer cylinder, and this can change totally the flow of the suspension. Here you see the suspension that is sheared just after it has been pulled in the rheometer, and you can see that the shear rate is quite homogeneous. But if you do the same experiment after several revolutions of the inner cylinder, then you observe that the flow takes place only very near the inner cylinder, and all this region is completely jammed. There is no flow. And why there is no flow? There is no flow because there has been a particle migration from the inner cylinder toward the outer cylinder. And so in this region, the particle volume fraction is higher than the jamming fraction. Okay, so here the suspension cannot flow. So how to make local rheometry? You have several techniques to do it. You can use ultrasound measurements. For instance, these measurements have been developed by Sébastien Manville in Lyon. And you can also use NMR measurements. as developed by Guillaume of Arles or Philippe Cousseau. You can use X-ray or X-ray tomography or 2D X-ray measurements. And you can also use suspension imaging, and it is what we have developed in Nice because it's much easier and cheaper technique. But of course, the drawback of this technique is that you have to use transparent suspension. So you have to match the refractive index of the particles and the refractive index of the suspending liquid. So you cannot study you cannot study real suspensions. You have to make your own suspensions to make local rheometry with optical suspension imaging. But with this transparent suspension, it's really easy to make local rheometry measurements. So to do that, you can pour your suspension in a wet cell, for instance. You add a dye to the suspending liquid, and you enlight the suspension with a laser sheet. And you take pictures with a camera situated orthogonally to the laser sheet, and then the dye, the fluorescent dye that is in the suspending liquid fluoresces and appears as a clear fluid on the pictures you take, and the particles that have been crossed by the laser sheet appear as black discs. So here you can see an example of the pictures we can record, and from these pictures or from the movies, we can make PIV or PTV in order to deduce the velocity field, and from the velocity field we can deduce the shear rate field, and the mechanics give us the variation of the shear stress. Well, give us the shear stress everywhere in the gap. So we have the shear rate, the shear stress. So we can measure locally the viscosity. And we can also, with this technique, we can also measure the distribution of the particles. So we can measure the concentration field. And also, we can measure the microstructure at the particle scale. So the microstructure at the particle scale can be represented by the pair distribution function. So the pair distribution function is mainly the probability to find a particle at a position R, knowing that there is a particle at the origin. Okay, so on this kind of picture, we take one particle, this one, for instance, and we measure where all the other particles are situated relatively to the reference particle. And then we choose another reference particle, and again, we measure where all the other particles are situated relatively to the reference particles. Okay, so with this statistical tool, we can draw a pair distribution function. So here, the red color means that there is a high probability to find the center of a second particle, and blue, the probability is low. And here you can observe that the pair distribution function is not isotropic, and the pair distribution function is not symmetric relatively to the velocity gradient direction. But you can observe that you have a high probability to find nearly contacting particles in the direction of the compressive axis of the flow. you know that a shear rate can be split up into a rotation velocity field and a compressional, elongational velocity field. And so in a simple shear flow, the particles, near contacting particles, are mostly aligned along the compression axis direction. Okay, and it has been shown that this asymmetry of the microstructure is a direct signature of direct contact forces between particles. So the asymmetry of the microstructure just means that direct contact between particles exists in non-Brownian suspensions. And the effect of this contact on the rheology of suspensions are really, really huge. And I'm going to show you, I have no time to detail the numerical method, but you can ask to Michel, who is a great specialist of that. But I go to the result, and the result is that the viscosity of a suspension, of a non-Brownian suspension, increases a lot when you increase the solid friction between particles. So here you have the variation of the relative viscosity, so the viscosity divided by the viscosity of the suspending liquid, the variation of this relative viscosity with the particle volume fraction. And here the red curve has been obtained for frictionless particle. And when you add frictional forces between particles, then you see that the viscosity increases. And it is interesting to note that when you choose a friction coefficient of 0.5, that is a very realistic value for common polymers such as polystyrene or PMMA, then the results of the numerical simulations are very close to the experimental results found in literature. Okay, so friction increases viscosity. And well, no, I'm going to pass this one, and or maybe not. Yes, yeah, I'm going to pass. No, in fact, you can the total viscosity can be divided into two parts, an hydrodynamic part and a contact part. So you can define the contact viscosity and the hydrodynamic viscosity. I say contact viscosity, but in fact, what it means is the contact contribution to the viscosity and the hydrodynamic contribution to the viscosity. Okay, and we can observe that through numerical simulations, we can observe that friction does not affect the hydrodynamic viscosity, but just change the contact viscosity. And when you increase the friction coefficient, then you increase the contact part of the viscosity. And the shear reversal experiments are a very, very good good way to measure, to evaluate this contact part of the viscosity. So the shear reversal experiments are very simple experiments, first proposed by Gadalamaria and Akrivos in 1980. And these experiments consist in shearing a suspension in one direction, and suddenly we reverse the flow direction. And we observe this transient response of the viscosity. So when the flow direction is reversed, the viscosity falls, passes through a minimum, and increases again to reach the value it had before the shear reversal. Okay, so this shear reversal experiment, when Galera Maria and Akrivos have proposed this shear reversal experiment, they obtain this kind of answer for the transient viscosity. And for the first time, they explain this transient response of the viscosity by the presence of an asymmetric microstructure in the suspension. And they were right. Oops. Here, they were right. Here we have measured the microstructure during the pre-shear here. And when the flow is reversed, we obtain the symmetric microstructure. Okay, so the compressional and extensional axes have changed when the flow has changed from one direction to the other. And just after the shear reversal, to pass from this microstructure to this one, we have to break this microstructure. And when the microstructure is broken, then we have almost an isotropic microstructure, and with a few contacts between particles. Okay, so that means that the difference between the steady viscosity, where we have a contacting pair of particles, and the minimum viscosity is almost the contact contribution to the viscosity. And this has been checked by numerical simulation. And in fact, we observe that the difference between the steady viscosity and the minimum viscosity is 85% of the contact contribution to the viscosity. Okay, so these shear reversal experiments are very good ways to evaluate this contact contribution to the viscosity. And it can be important, for instance, if you want to formulate a suspension with usually with a low viscosity, it's more interesting to measure the contact viscosity, or more or less equivalently the difference between the steady and the minimum viscosity, than the global viscosity. Okay, the effect of the contact of the contact properties of the particles will be seen more sensitively. Okay, so
Elisabeth?
yes.
I think there was a question about from Afshin, right?
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you go back to the past slide? Okay. For these concentric graphs, they are plotted over time. I mean,
sorry.
They are plotted over time. I mean, why they are? I mean, did you take just one picture and check the center of the other particles, or you record a movie and check all the position for the center of the particles?
Yes, all these pair distribution functions are obtained with a very large number of pictures.
Okay. So
about 10,000 pictures.
So in some way, can we call them like a, okay, I'm not sure if I can use of this word or not, but in some way can we call them speed or no? Because they are the position over the time. So in some way they are representing some kind of speed or movement over time. I don't know. But okay, if this is the case, why they are concentric? Why they are not like me? Of course, I know they are not symmetric over the shear we have, but we have a symmetric, I mean concentric symmetry. Why this is the case?
We do not have any. I know, but
if you go to the other slide, the one I referred, the next one.
To this one?
Yes, here. Yes. Why, for example, in this in the top one, why this is not like the other one, a circle symmetry? Why it doesn't have it? I don't know.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Yeah. Okay.
For this picture, for this one?
Yes. 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 That one. Why doesn't have symmetry? A concentric symmetry. The other have, but this one doesn't.
No, we do not expect. We do not expect isotropy. Okay, because here you can see that, for instance, in Y, well, if you superimpose this picture and this one, you are not going to have something isotropic.
Okay.
Okay, and in particular, you cannot have in theory, you cannot have any contacting particles along the velocity direction.
Yeah, now I see the point. Okay, yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay, because if they are exactly in the velocity direction, they have the same velocity, so they cannot be at contact. And if they are at contact, then they stay at contact comment on dit? Indéfiniment, for always. Okay?
Yeah, okay, no, I got the point. No, I was misunderstood that because of, I mean, in some way I was thinking it's showing some speed of the particles, but it's not that case. Okay, no, I got the point. Thank you.
Okay.
Elisabeth, we have, I don't know if you can read the chat, but we have 2 more questions in the chat. And I can also read them to you if you want.
Yes, please, because...
Okay, the first one is, how does the microscopic structure impact the constitutive models of viscosity on a microscopic scale?
Well, the important point is to know if the particles are contacting or not. The exact distribution of the particle doesn't seem to impact a lot the rheological characteristics of the suspension. Okay, it's not, but what is important is to know if particles are in contact or not. I don't know if I have something to show you that here. Maybe here, no, I have not here. Well, if you change the yes, I don't know if it's exactly your question, but if your question is the orientation of the microstructure as an influence on the rheological properties? The answer is no. It's not. Yes, it's not the orientation of the macrostructure that change.
Macroscopic
But it's
scale,
really
yeah.
the presence of contact or not. But of course,
Oh.
it's linked because if your macrostructure is orientated along the dilatation axis direction, then when the flow goes on, the contacts are broken. So of course it's important, but when you make the calculations, it's not what matters is really the number of contacts between particles.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Elisabeth, but the PDFs in this case are a signature of the contact. So you can use the PDF to show that the particles are in contact between each others, and that's what has an impact on the macroscopic scale, the presence of contacts.
Yeah, exactly.
The second question is, could you comment if the normal stress differences N1 and N2 be 0 in the case of the shear reversal?
No, I cannot. I cannot. I don't remember exactly. There are very few measurements of the transient of N1 and N2. There is one measurement by Coley and co-authors, and another one by Narumi, I think, but I don't remember the name of the journal, neither the year. If you want, I can send you the references. And to be honest, I don't remember what is the answer. You have a transient, but I don't remember how is this transient. I'm sorry.
We also have a third question that came up, and how do you deal with sedimentation with the focal rheology measurements that you perform in your lab?
Sedimentation?
Yeah.
So we do not have sedimentation because we use a density matched suspension. And that's also why it's so difficult to find good suspensions to make a local rheometry experiment, because we have to match both the refractive index and the density. But we manage. We have several systems. One is with PMMA particles. It's much easier than with, for instance, polystyrene particles. And with PMMA particles, you can to match both the density and the refractive index. You can use a Cargill oil. Cargill is a society, an American society that makes refractive index liquids, and they have developed also a refractive index liquid that also matches the density of the PMMA particles. And you can also just mix Triton X100 and water and zinc chloride, and then you obtain a liquid that is both matched in refractive index and in density.
Thank you, Elisabeth, and thank you all for the questions. So she's thanking you. Oh, okay, there is another question, and it's going to be the last one for this pause, and then we'll let Elisabeth continue. In numerical results, what is the criteria on eta s minus eta min to say there is contact or not?
There is no criterion. we just we make the numerical experiment. Okay, so we perform the numerical simulation with a shear reversal, and we measure the stress. The stress at sorry, where is it? So the numerical simulations are performed at controlled shear rate, and at each time step, we measure the stress. So at each time step, we have the viscosity. So we are able, from numerical simulation, to plot this curve. And this curve is experimental, but we can plot the analogous curve obtained numerically. And well, and that's all. So we do not need any criteria on if there is contact or not. Okay, is it clear?
Well, I would also say that if you do numerical simulations, you know if you have context or not.
Yes, but you needn't.
No, sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Serene, for your question. Okay.
Okay. Oh, how many time I have?
That's a hard question because it's a class, so it's all the time you want and all the time you feel.
No. Well, I'm going just to. I would like just to talk about oscillatory measurement because it's really important. Here I have plotted again the transient response of the viscosity when you do a shear reversal. Okay, and so that means that if you oscillate the suspension, then you explore this region. Okay, and in my introduction, I showed you the experiment of Pine and co-workers. Okay, but these experiments have been obtained when the suspension is in its steady state. Okay, and but when you oscillate the suspension for the first time, you observe irreversibility even for a very small shear amplitude. Okay, and here it's a result of Corte and the co-workers. This work has followed the work of Pine. It's almost the same group. And here you can, they have reported the variation of the number of cycles that are necessary to obtain a stationary state. And okay, so you can observe that so that means that what I've showed you before here is not obtained for the first cycles applied to the suspension, but these pictures have been taken when the suspension is in its steady state. And but it is what is important is that to reach this steady state, for instance, for an oscillation at low amplitude, so the suspension passes from suspensions where the particles experience contacts between them, and a suspension where the particles have moved in order to avoid these contacts. Okay, this steady state is named a super-absorbing state. And you can measure this super-absorbing, you can characterize this super-absorbing state by measuring the activity of the particles. So mainly the activity of the particles is the number of collision experienced by a particle during a cycle of oscillation. Okay, and you can observe that when, well, if you apply shear amplitude that is larger than the critical shear amplitude for the diffusion coefficient to become finite, non-zero, then if you measure the root mean square displacement of the particles, you observe that this root mean square doesn't change a lot with the number of oscillation cycles. But if you oscillate the suspension with a smaller shear amplitude, then you observe that the root mean square of the suspension decreases a lot, and the decrease of the root mean square displacement of the particles is accompanied by a decrease of the viscosity. Here it's the imaginary part of the viscosity that has been represented by the author, but you can observe the same kind of thing with the real part of the complex viscosity. Okay, so that means that when you oscillate a suspension, you force the particle to find a position where the particles do not come into contact. So you change totally the rheological characteristic of your suspension. You change its microstructure, you change the number of contacts between particles, and then you change all the rheological characteristics. So how do you say, conseil, my advice is to be very cautious if you make oscillatory measurement with a non-Brownian suspension. And again, this is due, this complication comes from the fact that the suspensions, non-Brownian suspensions, are thermal systems. So that means that all the microstructure, all the particle organization is controlled by the flow itself, and there is nothing to bring back the suspension to its equilibrium state. Okay, so there is no equilibrium state, in fact. So that means that each time you apply a flow, and it's necessary to apply a flow if you want to measure the rheological characteristic of your suspension, but each time you do that, you change also the rheological behavior of the suspension. So you have really to be cautious when you measure the rheological characteristics of non-Brownian suspension. Well, I have no time to talk about non-Newtonian behaviors, and I go directly to my conclusion. So I hope that you are convinced that non-Brownian suspensions are very special objects, and also very beautiful from my point of view. So you have, if you do a numerical simulation, it's easier. But if you make experiments, you have to be cautious with the finite size effects, and especially the layering that occurs each time a suspension, particles of a suspension are near a wall. So each time you have this configuration, you observe a particle layering that leads to an apparent wall slip of the suspension. Be careful also with the athermal properties of the suspension. That means that all is governed by the flow itself. So in particular, it means that the flow itself modifies the rheological properties of the suspension. And I would, if I had time, I would have talked about non-Newtonian behavior. And I just give you the conclusion is that, again, there is a great difference between polymers and suspensions, non-Brownian suspensions, because in non-Brownian suspensions, all the non-Newtonian behaviors are controlled by the shear stress and not the shear rate and not the time as it is usual in polymers. In suspension, in non-Brownian suspension, there is no characteristic time. And the only time you find when you make an experiment or numerical simulation, the only time you find is the inverse of the shear rate. So there is no non-Newtonian effect that can arise from a characteristic time of your suspension. And all the non-Newtonian effects that arise comes from the existence of a characteristic shear stress. But I have no time now to discuss about this characteristic shear stress. Okay, and just to finish, there are many things that would have been interesting to discuss. So the first one is what I said before, the origin of the shear thinning behavior and where we can find a characteristic shear stress. I would have loved to talk about normal stress differences, about shear-induced particle migration, about particle normal stresses, about the mu of J rheology. That is a very, very interesting part of the non-Brownian suspension rheology. And also the effect of particle rigidity on the rheology of non-Brownian suspension is something quite new and really interesting. So, but I have to come back another time to talk about all that.
Well, I would say that you can come back whenever you want.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Elisabeth.
It's, I mean, as I would say that as you said, the take-home message here is that there is a lot to talk about the rheology of these particles in Newtonian fluids, which seem very simple system, but they're not. But I think you gave a very good class about introductory rheology to this weird world made of particles. And so thank you. Questions now. Are there any questions, any more questions? It's funny because I do have some questions about one of these points, actually.
Okay, which one?
Well, about soft particles.
It's not shear-induced particle migration.
No. That would be easy for me. No, about the particle rigidity, and actually about the picture you have in the previous slides, so the one from Arshad et al. So what happens when you do? And of course, I mean, I partially know the answer. I just think it's a very interesting topic. So what happens when you do have softer particles and what happens to the contacts, to the direct interactions between the particles, and also then, you know, volume fraction and etc., etc.
Okay, thank you for this question. And I can show you results obtained by Duncan Gilbert, who is going to talk soon. I don't remember when, but he's going to give a talk. So Duncan compared the behavior of suspensions of glass beads, so very hard particles with a Young modulus of about 70 gigapascals. So he compares the behavior of this suspension to the behavior of PDMS particles. So the physical chemistry of the glass beads and of the PDMS particles is almost the same, okay? So it's the physical chemistry, yes, of the three systems are almost the same, and the only parameter that really changes is the rigidity of the particles. So 70 gigapascal for the glass beads, 50 megapascal for one kind of PDMS particles, and 1.8 megapascal for the other kind of PDMS particles. And what Duncan observed is that when the rigidity is decreased, the jamming volume fraction decreases. So when you decrease the particle volume fraction, for instance, here from this value of the jamming fraction, whoa, from this value of the jamming fraction to this value of the volume fraction, then when you do that, you increase the viscosity, okay? So when you decrease the jamming volume fraction, then you increase the viscosity. Okay, so it means that from this result, it means that when you decrease the rigidity, you increase the viscosity. And this is a little bit counterintuitive because one could have thought that when you decrease the rigidity, when the particles become more deformable, it is easy, it facilitates the flow, but it's not the case. And Duncan was able to explain this effect by saying that when you decrease the rigidity, you increase the contact area between particles, and when you increase the contact area between particles, then you enhance the contact forces between particles. And so, since as you have seen before, the viscosity increases when you increase the friction. So if you increase the contact area here, you increase the frictional force between particles, and then you increase the viscosity or you decrease the particle volume fraction. And there is also something quite interesting with the non-Newtonian behavior of the suspension, is that if you observe that the particle volume fraction is a function of the shear stress, that means that you can observe a yield stress in the suspension, because you can this curve that has been obtained by Duncan can be obtained either by fixing a particle volume fraction, for instance, 0.55, and and you vary, and if you vary the shear stress, then here you observe no flow, no flow, no flow, no flow, and when you cross the curve, then you observe a flow. So that means that the value here, so about 10 Pascal, is the yield stress of the suspension. Okay. So this curve, when you plot pi m as a function of sigma, it's equivalent to plot the yield stress versus the particle volume fraction. And in fact, here on the measurements of Duncan, you have both kind of measurements. The squares have been obtained by defining for each shear stress value the value of the jamming volume fraction, and the stars have been obtained by fixing the value of the particle volume fraction and by varying the shear stress. Okay, and you can see that you obtain a unique curve. Is that
Thank
okay
you.
for you, Michel?
That's even better than than what I expected. Thank you. We have we have 3 more questions. I'm gonna start from the last one because it's about, again, these soft particles. So Ashwin asks, so can we expect for very soft particles reaching to a plateau in viscosity or something else? Has anybody checked this? So what happens when you have very, very soft particles? Do you have a plateau in the viscosity?
I don't know. Of course, all what I've said is valid only if the particles are not deformed at their own scale. Okay, here we have calculated a kind of capillary number that is the ratio of the shear stress to the Young modulus, and this capillary number is very small. So that means that at the particle scale, the particles remain spherical. Of course, if you increase the capillary number, you are going to deform the particles. They are going to become prolate, and if the shape of the particle is modified, then you have another thing. It's not you cannot just refer to the contact area between the particles, but you have to take into account the shape modification in order to understand or to predict the rheological behavior. So it's another problem, and all what I've said is just valid for capillary number that are very small.
I honestly don't know if there is somebody who checked this for experiments. The problem with numerical simulations, I can say that it's incredibly hard, because you can imagine that simulating very soft particles, very deformable particles, requires a lot of computational time. And people have done this for some particles, for a very small number of particles, but a whole suspension or a whole system of thousands of particles, it's incredibly hard. Maybe soon. The other question, okay, we have Sudarshan asking, could you comment on how different are N1 and N2 to particle normal stresses, again, in the case of shear reversal? So we're talking again of shear reversal. It is very similar to the question, to the previous question, actually. So I think the person is asking for more comments about N1 and N2 and normal stresses in general in the case of shear reversal. But I think you said that
No, I'm sorry, but I can't remember the result. I can send you, maybe you have a group or something like that. So I can post the two references that I know from Collie and Narumi, who try to make a shear reversal experiment and to measure normal stress differences during a shear reversal experiment. But I'm sorry, I cannot remember the result.
I think that the most effective thing to do in this case would be just for you two to get in contact. This is also the reason why we do this kind of stuff. So just feel free to send an email to Elisabeth, and I know she will be very happy to just share with you the references you need. And another question, which actually the answer is not that far. So Viviana is asking if you can share your slides because they're very interesting. And I would say that also in this case, I mean, of course, the choice is up to you. We should discuss this with Leah, but I don't think we would share on our website the slides. It would be a lot. So probably also in this case, I would say to Viviana, just contact Elisabeth and talk about this with her. And again, I think she would be very happy to share with you the information you need. And that would be also much more effective than just trying to share everything on our website. Okay, and also Viviana is saying that for very soft particles, some interesting simulations have been done using red blood cells as models, also using capsules or vesicles. Are we talking about a lot of particles or just a couple? Because I'm not aware of people doing a lot of particles. A lot of, okay, then I definitely have to look into that. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we can stop here. Let me stop the recording.